So Alison, I would love it if you might be ready to welcome folks to this virtual Fete.
There you go, right? So we're live and everybody can hear us now?
Oh yeah, we've been live and they're still watching.
Okay, great. This is like almost a typical Zoom video, huh? So good evening, my name is Alison Potts and I am the newly elected president of the Nantucket Preservation Trust. And I'm really excited as one of my first acts as president to welcome you on behalf of the MPT board and the directors and staff to the 15th annual August Fete. The Fete is our major fundraiser, and we are sad that all. It is one of the best parties on Nantucket, and walking back in history through these great families, through historical homes, has always been one of the events that I look forward to every year. We certainly do appreciate the support at this time because it's critical for our cause. The Fete Steering Committee selected all of the houses to be toured in February. And then, of course, the world changed. Our event chair and our auction chair is Pro Grant, and both of them effectively planned two events in the same amount of time that it would normally have to plan one. We just want to thank both of them for their hard work and dedication. The theme of this year is There's No Place Like Home. And I think this theme resonates well with so many of us, especially these last few months. Nantucket is such a special place where many people look forward year after year and experiencing that feeling of coming home. And I'm lucky enough to call Nantucket my home. I know that many of you join us tonight and wish you could be on island, and I know that everybody at NPT joins me in saying that we wish you were here too. I would like to thank those responsible for tonight's event. The August Fete requires a lot of planning, which could not be accomplished without a dedicated team. Staff, Michelle Whelan, Rita Carr, Julie Keever, Emily Kahn, and Mary Berkman. We are so grateful to the folks who opened up their homes for video tours, and I hope you have all taken a look over the last week. They are amazing, and if you are a lifelong learner of all things Nantucket, you will love them. So a special thank you to the Sussex family, the Fremont Smith family, Penn Austin, the Museum of African American History, and Ken and Al Messina. Your time, your stories, and your love of Nantucket made it so much more special. We also want to thank those who have joined us for our live panel. Folks affiliated with the properties, Marcia Fader, Lemerchi Fraser, Chuck Lenhart of Sandcastle Construction, Brian Pfeiffer, and Betsy Tyler. As a nonprofit organization with large goals and big ideas, financial support is so critical. And we could have not put this event on without the supporter and of our underwriters, Silvercrest Asset Management and Susan's Ice Cream Interior Design. And we are very fortunate to have a group of local businesses and sponsors and auction donors. And we hope you will take the time to peruse a full list of our sponsors, donors, and leaders. Virtual sponsor booth in the expo area after tonight's presentation. We are deeply grateful for the support of everyone who has made this possible. And before I wrap up, I would like to remind you about our Sense of Place exhibition and auction, a carefully curated collection of works of arts and unique experiences, all inspired by Nantucket. I am sure you can appreciate that the auction and your generosity this year to our go forward success. Bidding will close Sunday evening, so please feel free to forward the auction along to your family and friends. Anybody you think that would be interested. There are many great items still available, including a house history and a house marker, or you can sponsor one of our programs directly. So I personally thank you for your support of the Nantucket Preservation Trust, and please enjoy the evening. I'm going to turn things over to Mary Berkman, our Executive Director. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. I'm so pleased that all of you have decided to join us this evening, and I'm really thrilled that you all stayed on while we got through our technical difficulties, and let's hope we keep moving on without a hitch. I know that this is going to be a very interesting conversation for anyone who's interested in historic preservation, antique houses, or Nantucket history. And I'd like to introduce you to our panelists this evening. Brian Pfeiffer is an independent architectural historian with over 40 years of experience working on historic preservation projects throughout New England. He's managed projects for Historic New England, the Architectural Conservation Trust for Massachusetts, Preservation Massachusetts, Historic, and little old NPT. He has been invited to lecture on New England architecture for the Irish Georgian Society, the Scottish National Trust, and the Institute of Advanced Architectural Studies at York, England. He's a contributing writer on New England architectural topics to Apollo Magazine, Antiques and Fine Arts Magazine, and Timber Framing, the Journal of the Timber Framers Guild. Betsy Tyler developed a love of Nantucket history while working as a professional librarian at the Nantucket Historical Association. That's the NHA for any of you who might be off island. You may hear us use that acronym. And NPT, that's us a lot. And Betsy also worked at the Nantucket Athenaeum. From 2012 to 2016, she was the inaugural Obed Macy Research Chair of the NHA and editor of Historic Nantucket. And she's currently a research fellow at the NHA. And she's written extensively about Nantucket houses and neighborhoods for NPT. And she's the author of more than 40 individual house histories and histories of public buildings, as well as the neighborhood guides, a walk down Main Street, the houses and their histories, and off-center, the Wesco Acres lots, the houses and their histories. Her newest book is 1,000 Leagues of Blue, the Pacific Whaling Voyages of Charles and Susan Veer of Nantucket. And to quickly put on my Nantucket Book Festival hat, you'll be able to hear a conversation with Betsy and I coming out later this month. So all things Nantucket merging here. Marcia Fader, hi, we can hear you. Yep, is Marcia Fader, AIA, is a licensed Nantucket-based architect specializing in historic restoration and preservation. She's directed the restoration of the Boston Higginbotham House and outbuildings of the Museum of African American History, Boston, Nantucket, for the past 7 years. She's worked for the NHA, the Mariah Mitchell Association, the Sconset Trust, and private clients. And she holds a Master of Science in Historic Preservation from the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University, and a Master's in Architecture from Tallinn, the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. Chuck Lenhart of Sandcastle Construction has won 2 NPT awards for his work on this year, on 2020, on 10 Martins Lane and 27 York Street. And he's been designing and building residential and commercial properties on Nantucket since 1982. Ken Jennings is an interior designer based in New York City. He's a graduate of the New York School of Interior Design and managed projects for over 30 years for clients along the entire Eastern Seaboard. He's a native of North Carolina and a part-time resident of New York City and Redding, Connecticut, and Ken now calls Nantucket home. Al Messina is a founding partner of Silvercrest Asset Management Group and sits on its executive committee as well as its board of directors. Al is also chairman of the board of for 2 nonprofit organizations, the Training Institute for Mental Health and Art Watch International. He's a native New Yorker, and he's been a summer visitor to New York for many years, but he has now settled into a much longer residency on Martins Lane, and I'm interested to hear how Martins Lane turned into a place where one could live year-round, so I think we'll hear more about that. John Sussick is retired from the family business, of which 2 of his sons are running, and he spends as much time on the island playing golf as he can. He was a board member of NPT and served as our treasurer. Marie Sussick has spent the last 32 years as a docent of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and was the last president of the volunteer organization. She's also served on the NPT board and was our volunteer coordinator for many years. And Lamerchi Frazier is an artist, poet, educator, historian, and has served as director of education at the Museum of African American History, Boston and Nantucket for the last 15 years. And her work at the museum highlights the museum's collection and exhibits and provides place-based education and interdisciplinary programs, projects, and lectures. Did I get everybody? Okay, good. And again, I'm Mary. I'm the executive director of the NPT. And I hope that you were able to get a chance to watch some of the videos that Rita Carr created for the video tours. Rita's really done an incredible job. She was hired in January to be our director of media and communications, and almost 3 months to the day that she was hired, we started working from home. And she's really transitioned to remote work, and she's able to take on this new skill of creating these videos. And I think even though she had never been to the Fete before, she really captured some of that magic of the Fete with those films. So that's kind of where we are. I have a bunch of questions, and yes, I think if you click on a picture of somebody else, then you can see. If you want to see one person when they're talking, if you click on the video, click twice to maximize the video, then you can see them bigger as they talk. And that's how that works. So I've got a couple of questions that came in over the course of the last couple of days. But if you have other questions, you can ask them. You can send me a message just while we got everybody here. You can send the message in the session, or if you want to send a message right to me, you go to people and then you click on my name, Mary Bergman. You can send a message to anybody. So if you click on the people and you see someone you wanted to say hi to or ask a question of, you can start your own little chat. You can start your own little video chat in this space. But if you leave, I don't know that you can come back. So that might be a problem. Okay. So Rita's here. And I guess let me just look at all of my questions here. I want to just start off with one totally oddball one, I think, which is, what's the best thing you've ever found or the strangest thing you've ever found behind a wall or under a floorboard? Anybody have any good, yes, go ahead, Omerchi.
Well, there was found in the, I believe it was in one of the buildings on Nantucket that we have at that campus, a cache of a gingham, needles, and it was actually found in one of the houses, and one of the people on Nantucket sent that to the museum as an artifact that we might appreciate, as it had a straw doll that was indicative of African American cultural artifact. And so that piece of cloth, as a fabric artist, was so important to me in its gingham. And another archaeological artifact that was found in the 1993 dig along the pathway of the African Meeting House was a case, which also signified that fiber production was a part of the life. So those are two pieces that I thought were very, very important in looking at what is the experience of people and what these things can tell us.
Wow.
We found some interesting things too, Mary. I think I mentioned them in the video, but I think they're fascinating. One of the workmen, when we were working on the ceiling on the second floor, found 4 pieces of paper. When I was told about it, I just assumed, oh yeah, it's probably newspaper that somebody put up there for insulation or something like that. But no, there were 4 invoices of disparate dates from 1770 to 1812, all related to the Chase family, who were Stephen Chase was the person who bought the house from Jonathan Macy and moved it around the corner to Martin's Lane. And they were invoices for various things, like 5 pounds of feathers, oil, and other things from a ship. And then the one I liked the best was for arithmetic lessons. So somebody was getting tutored. And the 2 that were dated before the Revolutionary War were in pound sterling, and the other two after 1776 were in US dollars. And they're hanging on the wall to my right at the moment, and they're just fun to look at. And I'm meaning to show them to Betsy Tyler and have her take a look at them.
I'd love to see them.
Anybody else have any interesting discoveries or unknown things they found?
I think out of that same attic, there were a number of other things that came out of that attic. I believe a corset, and then there was the box of what I termed as Christmas ornaments, but they were woven wreaths. That there was a box full of them. I think they were up there with those same papers where they had, and that area had been sealed off, so the items that were up there had been there for quite some time. And those are, I think, in the collection there that you guys have in the basement. We filled buckets with pipe stems and pottery shards and some fairly complete pieces of pottery.
Ken's creating a little museum in the root cellar
Right.
that you'll be able to visit.
I'm going to grab something.
It's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. You know, I think I'd want to mention two things from the Boston Higginbotham house that have been incredibly significant for the restoration. And one is a small piece of linoleum that was underneath some flooring. And it's a piece of linoleum that is black and red and some neutrals, and it's about 14 inches by 5 inches, but it gave us an indication of what would have been in Florence Higginbotham's kitchen of the 1920s and 1930s. And it was definitely something that was discovered under Floorboard. And the other item that I would mention was nothing that was really, this is so much noise. There was nothing it was something that wasn't really hidden, but it was something that we really didn't understand what it was, because that was the pile of cast iron pieces in the basement that we really didn't understand until Florence's daughter-in-law let us know that it really was her cook stove. And that, of course, we have resurrected, restored, and now have as a major feature of her kitchen. So in a way it was hidden because we had no idea what the cast iron pieces were. So it was a great help for the restoration.
Yeah.
Also before, thank you for that, Marsha. Also before the restoration of anything in the Florence Higginbotham house, we were looking at her things that were left in the house. And one of the significant features of what was found was play-up piano scrolls. And with that, as a 20th century collector of music that Florence was a record collection. But the scrolls of that, the paper, and her collection of those was of popular music at the time, and it was extremely interesting to see what she collected in terms of titles. So I thought that was a lot to add to African American cultural life that was a part of her possession of the house.
Yeah, excellent.
You know, if I could add, both of these projects at the Higginbotham house in the attic, the original roof, and that's these buildings both have a path of life where they changed and evolved. In the case of Martin's Lane, they moved, but in the Higginbotham house in the attic, the real original structure Seneca Boston would have put there is still there. but the roof is there with the paper that they use and the shingle and installed with cut nails. That's all kind of tucked away up in that attic, hidden beneath the secondary roof elements that they added there. But the real history of how that house started is hidden in there. And at Martin's Lane, the same thing revealed itself as in the areas that we opened up. The first things that we started to take apart, we found wallpaper, and we found a path where it had been before, a place where it had been before in the floor. You can see how it moved, and they recast things. The back of that building, the lean-to element on the back of that building changed multiple times. As we opened up the back of the building, you saw a completely different eave line that was much lower. In the basement, you could see that at some point there was a tiny little fireplace when we started that was only 2 feet wide, was at one point the summer kitchen, a 6 foot wide fireplace. And that had been added on, and that was in an addition. There was a clear addition where there was a shed form and then another shed form. So this progression of history reveals itself as you peek through, and all of it's still there. Most of it's there where you can see it. It's all there. But as people changed and they needed more, these buildings evolved. It's very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Great. Well, I have a question. Can you hear me? I know there was. Okay, excellent. As I look at all of my notes, is that 2 of the houses that we had tours of were houses that had, actually 2 of the houses and then one of the public buildings or the museum buildings has preservation restrictions, easements on them. And Brian, you won't be surprised to know that that's what we got some of the most questions about. And I think one of the questions that people wanted to know was, how do you know if a house is important enough to put a preservation restriction on it?
There are certain legal requirements to make a perpetual restriction. It has to be either eligible for listed in the National Register of Historic Places or in the State Register of Historic Places in Massachusetts. But more broadly, there are lots of buildings that, even if only fragmentary, sometimes preserve really remarkable little bits of things that are worth protecting. So it can be a flexible thing to protect the entirety of a building or to protect particular individual features that are really quite rare. Typically things like decorative paint never survive in great condition, or not never, but a lot of them, but they're worth protecting when you find them. And so it can be used as a conservation tool in that way.
And how would I know, or how could I trust that the future homeowners are going to follow this restriction? What kind of rules are?
Well, the rules are written into a deed recorded perpetual restriction. So once it's all signed and recorded, it's part of the property title in perpetuity. The only thing that can undo it is an act of the legislature, which they're certainly reluctant to do. It sets out the terms of enforcement. The really key thing is the entity that holds it must be a nonprofit. It has to have a program for monitoring it and visiting it, because in essence, they're becoming a sort of partner with the owner. They're interested in the preservation of the same things the owner is interested in the preservation of. And so staying in close contact is usually the way to achieve that. And also, once it's on the deed, it scares off people who really want to attack the building. If somebody really wants to modernize a building and create a modern statement, and they read the restriction, they realize it means nothing but trouble. And at that point, a good real estate broker will say, "Let me show you other buildings, what you'd like to do better than this one does."
So it helps, sort of like a self-selecting tool to find the person who's going to take care of the building, be the next steward of it.
Yeah, and I've worked with several hundred of these over the years, and it turns out that the profile of people who buy them is pretty interesting. It's fairly consistent. It tends to be people in midlife who buy them when they're sold. It tends to be more professional, academic, middle class. It's a very hard pill to swallow for the really flashy folks who want to completely change a building. It's selected down for a group of people who share the value of some public spirited sense of preserving a building.
Now, John and Marie, you have a restriction on your house. And did you put that restriction on, or was it there when you bought it?
We put it on.
What was the spark that made you think this is what you wanted to do to preserve the building for future generations?
You answer that.
Well, if you ever took a look at our house, you'd see an awful lot of beautiful moldings, architecture that
Floors.
they don't create today when they build a home. And anyone that would want to destroy this, this architecture, this history, would be a foolish thing to do. And that's why we put the restrictions on to begin with. You know, you've got to love beauty and art. This is what stimulates life. And if you want to gut our home and put in track lighting, you're in the wrong place. You better do this somewhere else, because we're not going to allow that to happen to this beautiful home that we live in.
I don't think we can get a better endorsement than that. So again, and it really is. I hope everybody had a chance to watch the video, of all the videos. It was really great to get to go inside. And I think that's always the best part of the Fete, right? Is to learn a little bit about the people that we live on this island with. I'll ask a question that I know, Brian, you've got to, yeah.
It comes to mind that should be mentioned. Unfortunately, in the United States, preservation laws only allow governmental agencies to protect the exteriors of buildings. And when you think about it, the exterior of the building is the weathering skin. It's intended to be sacrificial and be replaced. The craftsmanship of the frame, the finishes inside, the wear, and before it gives the meaning of this, none of that can be protected under public statute except by occasional landmark designations of a verified thing. But a preservation restriction allows the interior of a remarkable building or notable features to be protected. It's the only mechanism in the country for that.
Even on Nantucket with a historic commission.
Historic district commissions cannot touch the interior of the building. It's odd because in England, they can simply designate it by central government. They decide, we've studied Nantucket, we think it's important, so all the buildings and all their interiors are protected. And they can do that by fiat. That would never fly here, never.
Very interesting. Now, I have a question actually, and this is a real question. This is not an audience plant, but a question for which is that, and I hope that my Uncle John is watching. My relatives, my family owns a house out here that's circa 1933, and we have one family member who every year, every winter says, we should really just put new windows in this house. And so I guess what's the best, she believes that this is going to be more energy efficient. And then there's half the family that thinks, no, we should rebuild, we should get Brian Fitzgibbon or the window woman out in Western Mass, someone else. So I would love to hear from someone who has come up against that argument. And what's your best defense for why we should repair historic windows instead of replace them?
Could I just get the ball rolling on that one?
Yes.
I talk with a lot of clients, and people make these decisions based on impression. We have a cultural bias towards what's new and changing things to update them. And they don't, with my clients, I always say, let's just go and get the information. Let's figure it out. And in fact, in England, they studied the performance of historic buildings that are well maintained and found that performance quality in England will perform about as well as new buildings if they're maintained. And so for something like windows, I usually say to people, let's look at the insulating value of storm windows you can add to it. It's not perfect, but it's huge to keep the sash. And let's look at where elsewhere in the building, you may not have insulation at the cap, and elsewhere, you may get a far greater benefit by focusing your money elsewhere. And then in the end, also, the glass, we worked on one building in Nantucket where the glass is absolutely beautiful, making pretty. The windows were all mahogany frame. They're absolutely gorgeous. There's nothing wrong with them. And so a home window gives you nearly the rating you want without destroying the original pattern.
Excellent. You know, I'm reminded of something, and I hope we'll be able to get Betsy. Betsy, can you say hello?
I don't know what's
Yes, there
wrong.
you are. You're there. You're there, Betsy. You're great. Al and Ken were talking about how their house had been moved from Fair Street to Martin's Lane. And I know that we talk a lot about houses being moved, or people will call and they think their house was moved from here. They think it was moved from here to there. So how do you really know? And you definitively know that this house was moved, right? So can you tell us that story a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good, because I don't have a microphone icon there. This was one of the most exciting bits of deed research I've ever done, actually, because through the years, you know, so many people have suggested that a house was moved, but there's never any documentary evidence that we can unearth that gives that information. I mean, deeds are for land, and they might say land and dwelling, but I've never seen a deed for just a dwelling. So when I was researching Al and Ken's house, and tracing back from Stephen Chase, the owner, one of the early owners, or the earliest owner that we know about, I found this deed that said, it's from Stephen Chase's father, who actually lived on the corner in the Charles H. Robinson house, that property house. He was feeding a little strip of land to Stephen. So, and in that deed, he said that part of the said land is under the house, which my son, Stephen Chase, bought of Jonathan Macy and moved on the said land lately. So, okay, so he bought it from Jonathan Chase. I didn't expect to find anything from Jonathan Chase, but I did the deed research to see where his house might have been, or if he had more than one house. And then I found a deed, the really exciting deed, that said, it was from Jonathan Macy to Stephen Chase, carpenter, and he says, I'm selling you a certain dwelling house in Nantucket on the 23rd fish lot. And the intent and meaning of this instrument is to sell and convey my dwelling house to the said Stephen Chase without any land with it. And the said Stephen Chase is to have the house with everything that is fast to it and to remove it from my land as soon as he can conveniently. And that's 1801. So that's when the house was moved, and the 23rd fish lot is the corner of Fair Street. And I determined the house was the one previous to the current house on the corner was this house that was moved to Martin's Lane. So it's really a eureka moment. It's one of those moments where you think, who can I call? Who would get it? I called Michael May, Brian would. But it was very exciting. And it's so great to have that documented.
Could I add?
I don't know when Jonathan Macy built the house that moved to Martin's Lane. I haven't been able to determine that, but at least we know it was there in 1801 and it was moved to its current location then. So that was exciting.
That's a piece of extraordinary good luck. There's some other ones too. Yes. Michael May, I think, or maybe you, Betsy, found it. 86 Main Street, the Greek Revival house of the 1830s, had a newspaper advertisement that the house on the site was to be sold, and it was to be moved off the site by October 31st. So where that actually went, I don't know, but there was a building moved. And then I collect a lot of building contracts, and often the compensation is that there's a house there, and the owner will say to the contractor, you may have all the lumber or remove the building. And so a lot of these things are getting moved off or taken apart, partially reused and moved elsewhere. And the amount of reused lumber is called for in contract is enormous. So it doesn't surprise me, 55 Union Street, whether or not the building the old timbers came from was on that site, it's not surprising to have 18th century timbers reused in the framing of that house.
Right.
Oh, we can't hear you, Marcia. Sorry.
So now it's better. I just wanted to add that sometimes when we don't have Betsy Tyler with us on the job or in the deed office, there are some other ways to determine that a house has been moved in some way. And some of that happens when you get to study some of the older maps and you see the footprint of the house, and you can make the in my own house downtown that's 220 years old, it's obvious at least that it is on a newer foundation, and that it was moved. And so you can really do a study of materials sometimes and know that a poured concrete foundation is not going to be early 19th century or 18th century, and you're going to get confirmation that the structure was moved. And certainly it's happening to a lot of houses on the island right now that are just simply getting new basements, but in essence, kind of moving in place. Yeah.
Interesting. Now, I did get a question. The people were very interested in how Ken and Al and Chuck made the home comfortable, both with the climate controls and that you'd mentioned before that the house did not have heat. And so what was that like to transform this house into a house where one could live year round? What were some of the decisions that went into that?
Go, Chuck. Well, you know, the house was used as a summer house forever, but just before they bought it, somebody with very little consideration took mini splits and stuff all over the building. So that was horrible, and we immediately got rid of that. But we did excavate at the back of the building and created a small basement space so that we had a place to put mechanical equipment. And then from that point, we could do a high velocity system that it's the least impactful on the historic building like that, where we hid that under the crawl space. But we did a really good job of going around and repointing. The rubble foundation got repointed and sealed well, and then we could insulate that from the inside. And the portions there were portions in the back that were piers where we filled in between the piers. And so we completed the envelope underneath so we could control the moisture coming up into the structure. And so we created the envelope there. Any part of the building that we opened up, then we used foam, we used the spray foam product, we used the closed cell foam. So we really pushed the R values up as much as we could. And attics that we could get into, so anywhere we could go into, but we never purposely pulled the plaster down and put insulation in. We just didn't do that. But if we could get an area open where we could put rock wool in or things like that, we did that. And in fact, maybe the only other thing that we really could have done there was used blown in product on the front of the building in some of those areas that we didn't get to. But we also did the restoration of the windows. And in restoring those windows to work properly and fit tightly, that made a huge difference. That reduced the draftiness. So all of those things are just carefully working through the details to create a fairly tight envelope made a big difference. We dehumidify the house, we air condition the house, we heat the house. Because we took the roof off, we didn't need to do it here, but another way to subtly do it is you could add a layer of insulation on the outside when you change the roof. And you could do that with a couple inches of insulation and make a minimal change to the image of the house on the street. And that does create a subtle change to eaves and rakes, but it's a way to insulate it and not really change the presence on the street.
Interesting. So those of you who are homeowners or live in a historic house, whether it's Nantucket or here, remember a historic house can be 50 years or older. What made you decide that that's what you wanted to do instead of to build new or to buy a newer house? Or what attracted you to the idea of living in a historic house? What would you say to somebody who's thinking about buying a historic house or wanting to restore a historic home?
Who wants to? But
Al, you've been nominated, I believe.
I think so.
Well, I'll tell you this. The first house I ever owned, I built, and it was a modern structure. in Wainscott, New York, and I absolutely loved it. It was wonderful. I had a great architect. I was very fortunate. I loved living there, at least living in this house. After a while, I thought East Hampton was not really for me, but and so we left. But I'll tell you one other inspiration. At one time, I worked for a firm called Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrat, and I was a good friend of Dick Jenrat, who is well known in preserving old houses. He liked houses, particularly that were built between 1820 and 1850, and most of the houses he owned at the time of his death were from that period. And I had visited almost all of them, and you know, he took old houses, and some of them really, really run down. The one, for instance, that he owned that it was his favorite along the Hudson was in pretty bad shape. It was an old Livingston house, and he was able to maintain the integrity of the house and yet modernize it for contemporary use. And that sort of woke me to the possibilities of that. And I think it was ever since then, I thought, oh, I really want an old house. I want to do that. Now, when we saw this house, this was just too beautiful, too lovely, with too many years in it that I wanted to preserve. I didn't want to see anything happen to it. And we both fell in love with Ted Martin's Lane and wanted to keep its Quaker simplicity.
Great. Thanks,
Except,
Al.
of course, the air conditioning.
You know, I used to say we don't need air conditioning on Nantucket. I don't know that's, I got mold in my house from saying that. So, yeah.
Mary, can I say-
Well, because this house was moved here, the other thing is that it doesn't face south. The front does not face south. Not that really mattered, but it was something I learned about the lean-to houses on Nantucket.
And I know John and Marie wanted to pipe in as well.
Well, I think we both, I don't know when I started loving antiques. I'm trying to remember, and I don't. But when I started in that museum, the first galleries that I was trained to do was the American Wing. Back in the early 1980s, they redid the entire American Wing galleries. And my favorite parts were the very earliest parts. We have a room from 16, I forget now, it's been a long time. But so when we came to Nantucket, it just seemed to me that you didn't want a modern house. I wanted an old house that I could put antiques in. And I love the floors in this house. We've got a room in the wart. One of the boards is I don't know, what is that, more than a foot wide?
Oh, they're 16 to 18 inches wide.
It's just all of that. We just love all of that. And to me, a modern house in Nantucket, maybe if we had another house, if we had two homes here, maybe we'd have a modern one on the beach or something. But, that's not for us. And that's why in fact, we're in the dining room right now. We had a leak here. And actually, sometime in the 1920s, they must have replaced the original floor because it was, what do you call that stuff that it was?
It was strip flooring.
Strip flooring. So we had a leak that ruined the floor, and we were delighted because we could replace it. And this is before we had restrictions. But we replaced it with boards that came from an old barn in Vermont. And so it just fits perfectly into the house. And we got rid of that strip flooring that probably was very modern in 1920. Also, you're talking about facing south. And our house does, you notice it's a little on a slant, and it does face due south. And we do have modern windows on the back wall because if you look at it from the outside, the window framing is different. That was probably a solid wall at one time because it faced north. And somewhere along the line, I have no idea when, maybe back in the 20s again, 1920, whatever, it was opened up and these more modern windows were put in. But the rest of the house is all old. We have, like I said, 4/4s and 12/12s, 6/6s, and 4/6, and all kinds of things, which we love. We just love.
Yeah. Now, I had a question for Marcia and Lamerchi, which was, how did you come to decide to tell the story of 200 years of history in one house? And for those of you who might not know what I'm talking about, if you go and watch the video about the Boston Higginbotham house, that's a house where each room, decisions were made to try to interpret the history of 200 years of ownership by free Black Nantucketers. And a lot of times a house will choose a period to, you're looking at one period of history in a house. But it's very interesting that this has gone back. You're telling a big story through this little house. So I'd love to hear just a little bit about how you came to those decisions.
Yeah, I'd like to say that when the museum purchased the Florence Higginbotham house, Boston Higginbotham house, there was no knowledge of that element that Charles Linhart talked about, that there was this roof that would tell us that it is an actually 18th century home. The adjacent land to the African Meeting House just made it important to have the house as a basis of having an extensive property and campus for one reason. Other after the restoration, oh my God, after the restoration in 1999, there was the idea that to have this spread would be wonderful. So as the museum's board decided to purchase the home, they didn't really know what they were getting into. It wasn't until Jack Wade and Associates did a historic studies report that roof that was covered in canvas was actually seen as significant to mark this a house built in the 1700s. And so everybody went, oh my goodness, this is the opportunity to explain African American life on the basis of land ownership and our stories being invested in the land as a way of vetting African American history with agency for oneself and the beginning of family and anchoring the New Guinea community. Before that, we had information, yes, but we did not have that information. We were able to see a deed. There was this transfer, this negotiation that was happening. That was important to underscore the basis of African American life being in every facet of what was available then, and how this was not a people, it was our opportunity to tell a story that more fully orbed people of African descent. And with Thankful Micah being Seneca Boston's wife, the relationships between those of African descent and indigenous people. So it's a shared history of more than 200 years. And so this was an opportunity that just swelled in our hearts.
It's really an incredible story, and I think it's, is it true that people couldn't put their money in banks, and so buying property was a way to invest your money as well for Black Nantucketers?
Maybe, I don't know about that. But there was already that, the whole acquisition of land to establish oneself to be able to vote, to belong to a church, to do this. I mean, land acquisition was the thing at that time. Excuse my kind of colloquial speaking here, but it was an important factor in gaining personhood, in being established and acknowledged. So when we talk about sovereignty of the island itself and the indigenous people, that was not regarded when it was being purchased and then owned by 7 white men. So when we talk about this, while indigenous people were being divested of their land,
Right.
African Americans were gaining land, and Native people had a relationship with it. So this is an important thing.
Yeah, that
I
is
think,
really, really wild.
I think what I'd like to add to that early decision and understanding of the house is more of the architecture speaking, because when you begin a study with a historic structure report and you identify the architectural features of the house, I think that with the Boston Higginbotham house, if those architectural features had consisted primarily of the time 18th century when Seneca Boston would have built the house, perhaps a different decision might have been made. But being that we not only had original fireplace paneling from the 18th century, which worked well with the roof framing and all, but it's visible, and it really, you really cannot see and understand that from the street when you look at this house, that it might have this inside story to tell. But then you move forward, and with the deed research and the architecture combined, and you begin to see that you not only have 18th century work showing and having survived, but you also have 19th century and 20th century. And with the deed research, you come to understand that you had 200 years of formerly enslaved, of freed African Americans, ownership. And you understand that you want to honor the full 200 years. And it would not be appropriate to focus simply on Seneca Boston, even though that's an amazing story in and of itself. But it was a much larger story to tell. And I think that is what the restoration blueprint, the preservation blueprint set out to do, was to honor all those changes that were made as the house evolved with those various owners, from Seneca Boston, his descendants, and right through to Florence Higginbotham. And that was a very a very different decision to make, in a way, I think much more challenging than putting the house back to the way it might have been when Seneca built it.
Right.
But definitely you walk through and you can go through and see the whole story unfolding.
Yes, and that was one of the features of the excitement about the house. As we were doing the capital campaign for the restoration of the Acton House in Boston, and it being 1806 construction, the idea that we had now, the basis of a family that had in a dwelling that is from the 1700s, was a focus. Prior to that, the focus was Florence Higginbotham herself, because of how the museum had gained the property with purchasing it from Wilhelm Higginbotham. And so this idea that was the unique site in the country that would then give some breadth to who African Americans were, their styles of living, how this was an island, number one, that this was a place where the sea was important to their livelihood, and Seneca Boston, being a weaver and a seaman, was very important to this establishment. And so it was just an extraordinary opportunity that began to swell through the different archaeological excavations to then build that story that Marsha just made reference to, of this 200-year expanse.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it became in a different passionate zone. You can look at it as evidence that defies the very narrow narrative that had heretofore been in existence about African American life. And so it was
I think that's a
museum to expand.
that's
that
a great say. Yeah, I think that's a well. I'll let Brian, but
I would like to ask a question of you. When I first saw the house, I was really fascinated. I cannot think of any building in New England, but I haven't studied this. I don't know if the Museum of African American History has any building in New England that descended so long in an African American family, where the continuity was there, and then the final twist with Florence Higginbotham, that complicated relationship with the woman that she'd worked for, and reversing who lives where. It's absolutely fascinating about people, their relationships, and the family and their standing in the community over time. Are there other buildings like that, or is that really a one-off at this point?
Well, as far as we know, heretofore we have not had one uncovered. That does not mean that there isn't one that exists, but right now we're it. And so
it's absolutely fascinating.
to post about this. No.
it is one of the best stories, and I think I'm glad you mentioned this idea of preconceived notions, because one of the things that I wanted to ask was what and posit this to all of you. What is the misconception that you think people have about preservation on Nantucket or just in general?
If I may, people flatten it out into an either or. So you get people, I get clients who want to restore their building to the last word in the 17th century. And I say to them, that's a lie. You can't. You can't make the paints that way. You can't reproduce old wood. You can only start with the material you've got and make choices with it about how you handle it. And that along the way, part of preservation is not just embalming. There's a certain tension about incremental change. That if you go in and gut a building, it's really damaged. But to go in and tinker with it a bit, that's what's always happened. And the project I worked on at 86 Main Street, we went in, we studied the building really carefully. We identified all its pieces in the range. And then we worked with the owner about what to do with them. And there were several places where what I recommended for preservation didn't fit with what they needed. And so we debated back and forth, and some of them they abandoned and some of them they wouldn't abandon. And I have to say, when the building was done, two things I was really opposed to turned out to be really good choices. So I think it's that debate and the incrementalism and seeing it as the Higginbotham house. You get to understand the building, and then you start to make some decisions about what preserves and represents the things that are really unique about it.
That's a great answer. Does anybody else want to weigh in? Or just Nantucket history, or maybe what was something that was a notion that you had that was challenged through the process of restoring a historic house, or searching through the history of a historic house, or I think that was a great answer. So it's okay if we don't have any others, because I was at the event. We'll time out.
Yeah, I think that I could say that I find it kind of just inherently challenging. It didn't challenge the preservation blueprint to restore the 18th century fireplace paneling and the Greek Revival mantelpiece. Even the kitchen mantelpiece is still there. I find it slightly problematical that we have no fireplaces in the house. So these amazing portions of history that are so representative and so typical for their period, so appropriate historically, but they cannot function. They do not have fireplaces because all the chimney mass was removed. And so it's still and always in the back of my mind that at some point we would be able to technologically and appropriately create a screen that has a fire in it, even though we have we have done a faux painting in perspective that shows brickwork there. I still think that it's always challenging that we can't have a fire in that fireplace.
I recently was at the Papal Palace in Avignon, where they have the same problem, because in the historic period, the rooms were covered with tapestries and color, now just bare stone. And you take iPads now, they give you one, and you go through and you press the period you want and you hold it up and you turn it, and as you move it around the room, it shows you the rendering of what this may have looked like. And it's an incredibly effective way of doing this without having to create a fake anything. And it really, you get the sense this building has changed a great deal. And once it was a lavishly colored building.
Yes.
I don't know if that may be very expensive. I'm sure the African American Museum would like to raise a few $100,000.
Well, what we have done in a project with monuments that I created as an artist for young people to reimagine monuments was to use augmented reality to take 360-degree photographs of structure and then send them through a software program where they can manipulate. The teenagers began to manipulate after they had done extensive research on these monuments. And for instance, in Boston Common, the Crucifixion Monument, he's in the relief of the monument. They stood him up next to the upper on the top of that monument through augmented reality. They changed the Thomas Ball sculpture in fact Park Plaza with Lincoln. So it is not out of the range of the thinking for presenting in the Florence Higginbotham House Marsha's concerns about the fireplaces, and we can start a project with our young people who will be our next leaders into these conversations about preservation and who should be engaged, a project that would then incur the kind of technology that you were investing in when you were visiting another site, Brian. And so I look forward to those moments when we can talk about what may have been there and how then we can bring it to the front.
I think it makes an important distinction too, because when the restorer goes in and reconstructs something, it is by definition a fake. It is not authentic. It may be the right measurements and all this, but it's not the real thing. And so to imagine it in a way that doesn't harm the building or change it really gives greater scope to what really is this thing. And I think it's particularly for teaching, I think it's a great question.
I think so too. I agree.
I think that's just really interesting to think about, that I love the idea of how can we use, alternate realities or virtual realities to better understand our places. And we're still, on Nantucket, our deeds are not completely digitized. So you still have to go back, as Betsy could tell you, to go back and page through. So we've got a lot of technologies and they're all working together to help us tell these stories about Nantucket. Yeah. And some of them work better than others, as we learned this evening. But I really do appreciate everybody's sticking with us as we got through our technical difficulties. And I promised you that it would only be about an hour. So I'd like to keep to that promise. But I just want to thank everybody who participated in this event, everybody on our panel, everybody who watched, and the folks who let us into their homes who couldn't be there here tonight. I'm always amazed when someone has somewhere to be these days, because I don't. There's nowhere to go. But we've got we're really grateful for your support of the Nantucket Preservation Trust all the time, but especially now, as you can imagine. This is for those of you who don't know, I've worked for NPT for about 3 years, but I started this job as director of the organization in January. So this has been a interesting 7-8 months, and it's a tough time for nonprofits. So those of you who bought tickets to this event, we're so thankful. And there is our sponsors, we've had some great sponsors and underwriters, Silvercrest Asset Management and Susan's Isis Green Interior Design. And you can check over on the little left-hand side. This is Expo, if you want to go look at the Expo booths. Those are our other sponsors. We've got our auction running still, nantucket.givesmart.com. And Okay, so that covers that business. And we've also got our symposium coming up in September. We're going to be using the same platform now that we've gotten good at it. It's called Rescuing History in Nantucket in Response to Rising Seas. So as you know, Nantucket Preservation Trust has been thinking a lot about sea level rise and adaptations to historic structures. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that in another month. And thank you all so much for coming. And a round of applause for all of our panelists.
And can we go out like this to touch everybody?
Yes,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, that's what they do with the online workout classes, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your night. And I can't wait till we can all be in person because but anyway, we'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Mary.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.